You know, back when I was in the academy, we would follow every toast with a song.
Let's just jump. Yeah, go ahead.
Hey everyone, we're in the middle of a really interesting conversation that we're going to continue, and then we'll start the episode. But we're recording now, so hi Jake.
Hi Jay.
So we're talking about the kind of interesting intersection now of religion in America in terms of post-Trump and post the January 6th attempt at a coup in Washington D.C. And I was relating to Jake that I think one thing that we're seeing the world over when it comes to the intersection of Christianity with politics is that one of two things are happening. Because I'm writing this book right now that has a lot to do with Ireland and Irish Catholics. And, one thing that's happened in terms of Irish Catholicism after the revelation of all the child molestation charges against the church, especially the Vatican, and the Vatican's role in it, is that you have and this is relation to you saying, like, if you have to pin your beliefs to things, you consider yourself more of a Jesuit. A lot of Irish Catholics have gone out of their way now to vote up things in Ireland, such as abortion rights, same-sex marriage, and a host of other, traditionally anti-Catholic causes, but still in their minds remain Irish Catholic, but have completely divorced themselves from the idea of the church, and especially the Vatican. And a lot of that has to do with a lot of the damage that took place, especially in Ireland, and especially here in the Northeast, where Irish Catholicism is really strong, where a lot of the damage towards children happened here, and there was a lot of organization by the Vatican to cover it up. So the effects in Ireland have been really interesting in seeing how Christians change their Christianity in reaction to the change of establishment. And I think what you're saying is something that's happening to a lot of Americans here, where their churches really had to take a stance on whether they were pro-Trump or anti-Trump. And in some ways, taking the stance of whether you're pro-Trump or anti-Trump is almost taking a view on Jesus. And I think we're at a very... I don't want to use the word dangerous, because there's a lot of negative connotations to that. I don't necessarily think that you're going to see something like a crusade, but I think the war that you're actually going to see on the conservative side of the body politic here in America will be a war about what Christianity means here in America, more than anything else. Where, on the outside, I think here in America, you're also going to have, if we're going to continue with this left-right dynamic, which we seem to be locked into now, the left is going to be trying to go after white nationalism in the form of white Christianity, and they're just going to have a very horrific time in terms of dealing with that, because they just don't have the language or the understanding of what they're dealing with.
Well, just to make some comments before we get into the Star Trek episode, what I said to Jay that catalyzed his comments was that, some of the positions that he talked about and he mentioned in terms of just told me about, there was one church member in Kansas who did not, I guess he was a congressman or something.
Let me look up his name.
But anyway, while he's looking it up, that supposedly there was a congressman who did not support Trump, and he was actually excommunicated by his church, and just some other, the positions that many conservative and evangelical Christian groups have taken toward Trump. Um, and it's just so the whole movement, the whole thinking, and what Trump has represented is so anti-Christ, anti-Jesus, that I think there are many American Christians who don't buy into that, but there is a lot that have bought into this the only word I can say is a perverted view and practice of Jesus's teaching. And what I said to Jay, it's just that I've come to the point that I'm not comfortable really calling myself Christian anymore. I think that word is so tainted by many that I said firmly believe, I probably believe stronger than ever in Jesus's teachings. So I call myself a Jesuit, but of course that name is already taken by the Society of Jesus, which I am well aware of since I went to a Jesuit college. So that's all I have to say about that.
Okay. Just to leave off on this, and then we'll get into the episode. With the advent of technology and a lot of what we're talking about actually today in the episode, spirituality is going to become a riskier and riskier business going forward than people think. Uh, the intersection of technology into the realm of the spirit does not necessarily mean that science will do away with the old world or new world belief systems. If anything, they will evolve them and change them in dramatic ways. And I think one of the reasons you're seeing so many different and difficult conversations now happening in even the mainline religions is because we have things like the internet, which can, not only proliferate historical and factual information, but can now proliferate misinformation as well.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's one thing that we weren't really prepared for.
No.
When it came
there's been discussion on that on radio shows this week. Yes.
Yeah. So actually, let's get into the episode, because I think we have some parallels to talk about here. Because so everyone, hi, my name is Jay Reckward. Welcome to Where No Bubs Has Gone Before, a Star Trek Next Generation fan podcast starring me and my father, Jake Reckward, as we explore the Next Generation from season 1 to season 7 for the benefit of my son and Jake's grandson, Ben the Bear. And of course, we're releasing these episodes for communal enjoyment. Hi, Jake. How are you?
I'm good.
Weird having to do this twice, but so Lonely Among Us is Star Trek The Next Generation, Season 1, Episode 7, came out November 2nd, 1987. And I actually liked this episode a lot. I watched it 3 times in preparation for this podcast, which, we usually watch the episodes at least twice. And it really wasn't until the 3rd time that I finally struck into what I really liked about this episode. It's really an episode about the Enterprise crew intersecting with an alternate life form that is in many ways an unexpected explorer amongst them. And I think there's a lot of really cool things in this episode to talk about. But in general, what did you think of the episode, Dad? And did you enjoy it?
I enjoyed it because it had an entertainment quality to it. Just about they were in a diplomatic mission to take the Antigons, which were reptilian type species, and the Soleil, which were the cat type. Oh, the Antigons were the cat type people. The Soleil were the reptilians.
Yeah.
And there was a comment about that there was conflict over their economic systems were different, which again fit in with 1987, you still had
Oh, their god
um,
forms, their economic systems. There's that scene where Picard's kind of making fun of both of them,
yes, yeah,
um,
that's right, he does.
because
But it's
they're
in
yeah they're vexing over the fact that like these two planets that are a major part of the I guess the uh, better Renner system.
right,
They've suddenly become warp capable, and they both
yes,
want to join the Federation, but they're
right,
both mortal enemies with each other. So they're on the
right.
way to the planet Parliament. But sorry, continue.
So that was sort of the general you know top line story. It was interesting. Now the in the last episode, the chief engineer was Scottish, which was a
Mm-hmm.
nod to Scotty. Now he's South Asian, and poor South Asian guy doesn't get through this episode. Um,
Engineer Singh.
Engineer Singh, yes. So, but once you get through that story and so forth, um, I think what you said is the heavier underlying story here is, um, that they came on, as you said, they came on a different being that, and I guess that energy field, there may have been multiple beings there, but they were more of an energy pattern.
Mm-hmm.
And they talked about both humans and this other entity or other beings had a passion for exploration. There was a statement that they exist as an energy pattern free of limitations of matter, so that he might travel anywhere at any velocity, which is
Yes.
interesting because it goes back to the last episode when we talked extensively about the relationship between space and time and thought.
Yes.
So it's sort of a continuation of that theme that the writers, may have picked up on and kept. And then what it really brings up is, you kind of hit on this, is what are the possibility of different states of being?
Mm-hmm.
Brings up, the eternal question: do humans, do men and women have a soul? Are there ghosts? Are there
Mm-hmm.
spirits? Um, and then the other thing is, when Picard was absorbed by the entity, because they thought he was an explorer and they could explore together. He ended up having to come back because Troy figured out, I think, that the combination of you know uh, the essence of Picard and this new being was not compatible. He could
Mm-hmm.
not he could not exist out there. So, what's that saying about a mismatch in energy patterns or what? But I think that's the real interesting thing from a science fiction perspective that the episode brings up.
So, and you know, with the previous conversation we had right before, I'll tie it right back in at the very end. I think, and one thing that, so one place that I go to look at some of the notes for the episodes is this website called Memory Alpha,
Hmm.
memoryalpha.fandom.com, which basically is everything Star Trek. It's basically a gigantic online encyclopedia. They refer to the entity as the Beta Renner cloud because
Hmm.
that's what they run into, this energy cloud. And, getting back to the first thing that you brought up, kind of the question of, you know, the show keeps running in, the writers keep having the crew kind of run into the question of the physical versus the incorporeal, and really kind of how exploration may actually be in the realm of the kind of inner space where the non-physical exists and not the physical that everyone is expecting us to interact and relate to when we think about the typical sci-fi story with aliens and spaceships and warp drives and things like that. Um, it's been a very interesting theme that's been consistent in this season, and I've been really surprised about how much it kind of repeats itself over and over again. Um, there is, getting also back to the previous episode we recorded, where no one's gone before. I think the thing that I find most interesting about the episode when it comes to the question of the spirit and ghosts is, you know, we really always we always kind of have this idea of exploration that is very material, that we're going to go out into the world or go out into the solar system or go out into interstellar space and find things that are on an anthropomorphic level, you know, something that we can grasp, something that we can see, hear, touch, think, and feel about. I don't think that we ever expect to run into beings of thought and energy. And it's in some ways it's a terrifying proposition, because it gets back to the conversation we had at the very end of the last episode we recorded about uh, kind of the limitations of science in terms of measuring, articles of the spirit or things like magic or ceremonial ritual occurrences, the paranormal or the supernatural. I think that this is another episode where we see an example of the crew running into something that consistently they can't deal with, and they don't have a level of technology that can deal with it. One thing that I noted that was very interesting: this entity didn't interact with data at all during the entire episode, where in previous episodes there's a lot of interaction with data. I find it very interesting that the writers kind of eschewed the typical ease of having an entity that is an energy pattern that even says, like, when I first came aboard the ship because I was accidentally captured by the Enterprise while you were passing through my cloud, or our cloud or us cloud. It actually, one side note about this entity, it actually kept changing its pronouns.
Mm-hmm.
Um, in that speech that Picard gives right before he initiates his escape to the transporter pad, in this really great speech that Patrick Stewart just acts his ass off on, um, he keeps changing the pronouns. Like, it keeps going back to he, us, they, them, we. So the energy pattern, or the beta Renner cloud itself, may not just be a single identity or consciousness or entity. It may be
Mm-hmm.
many, as you mentioned previously before, which also brings into question, um, if there are, let's say the Enterprise ran through that cloud and they ran into hundreds of thousands of different energy patterns, and this one energy pattern decided to hop aboard accidentally, quote unquote, to explore, because it keeps saying, like, I was accidentally on board, but
Mm-hmm.
once I
Mm-hmm.
got there I decided to explore and see who you all were. And then, I was kind of looking for one of you to see if you wanted to return and explore with me. um, there's a aspect of duality to the entity that I don't think that we really recognize at first, and it took me into. Oh, sorry. Go ahead. You want to jump in?
No, yeah. I mean, the fact that you said duality is interesting because, Troy in various episodes
Right.
makes various key comments. And one of the things she mentioned, I made a note of it. I can't remember what specifically it was in reference to, but she talks about, she senses duality in human decision making.
Oh yeah. That there's, and she applies this to Picard, like, when she feels people making a decision, that she actually feels two different things being weighed.
Right.
Like people can go one or people are weighing possibilities, and they're usually weighing a binary of possibilities.
Hmm.
Um, yeah, I found that interesting too. And then she's probably, you know, I think she was trying to say that when she knows that the entity is there, she kind of measures a removal of that decision
Hmm.
making process.
Hmm.
And that's an interesting thing in itself that we can explore for a moment. Um, human thinking patterns are something we still don't understand because we don't understand a lot of the science behind the brain. Despite some of the miraculous things that we can do, as everyone know, as some people may know, my wife was a uh, OR nurse for several neurosurgeons at the beginning of her career. Happy birthday, Margot, by the way. Um, some of the things that we can do with the brain are amazing, and some of the ways we can heal the brain, some of the ways that we've discovered the brain can recover, some of the science that's gone into consciousness and neurology, and just some of the things that we discover every day with neuroscience are wondrous. But the truth is, we still don't know a lot about how the brain ticks, how it's made up, how it operates. It gets kind of back to some of the things you were talking about, Dad, about figuring things down to the atomic level. We haven't figured out we haven't figured out the brain in terms of how it functions, kind of down to neural the neurological level of the subatomic level. Like we haven't gotten there yet.
Well, interesting. Yeah, I read an article, and I didn't read it in depth, but it said something about that memories can actually memories are actually stored chemically,
Yes.
and like I I that's way above my scientific pay grade to figure that out. Although if I read the art had time to have read the article in depth, I may have understood it better. But that's just fascinating, and that gets to what you were saying.
Well, I so kind of getting into this kind of thing Troy's talking about our decision making. There's kind of this binary she notices that we're always between two decisions. Getting kind of to the chemical thing you're talking about. There's this musician that Ben likes listening to. Hi Ben, the show's about you. Um, there's this musician named called Melody Sheep, and I'll include a link in the YouTube description below for everyone. But Melody Sheep does a lot of like PBS mashups for using kind of like science TV shows,
Hmm.
science education shows, and he makes kind of electronic music go along with it. And um, he does one. He uses a lot of his earlier tracks involve Carl Sagan.
Hmm.
And one thing that Sagan said, God, I'm gonna botch this. The moment you want to remember something, you forget about it. But oh, you know, so much of what the brain is doing is perceiving things around us and having to make sense of things. And one thing that our human brain has done is perceive the mathematical equivalent of one versus zero. And like, if you really think about it, there's no logical reason that we formed the idea of one. We just did. Like, if you really deep down ask mathematicians, where do one and zero come from? Like, why did we just come up with one and zero? Where are these magical, ineffable numbers? It's kind of like asking, what's the word of God? What's the logos? Where did the logos come from? They don't know. They really don't know, but somehow the human brain has been able to distinguish between one and zero. So we have this binary that is kind of embedded in everything that we do. And in some ways, it conflicts with some of the things that we do because humans, even though we have binary ways of thinking, we are not binary creatures by any means. There are things that we are very prismatic on, if that's a good word to apply to it. But I think what Troy's noticing here is that when this entity is involved, somehow that binary disappears. And that says something about our neurology versus the better runner cloud's neurology, if it has such a thing. That maybe energy maybe energy, while it can think and be sentient, doesn't work on the idea of neurons. So how in the future do we actually measure an entity that doesn't have neurons but can somehow think and talk and feel and explore like we do, but is not, like you said and like Picard says, or as the entity says through Picard, not bound by the physical.
Yeah, well, what you just said,
And I feel like I've been talking for a long time.
no, well, what you say, what I understood you say is that in terms of human processing, there had to be a concept and understanding of one
Mm-hmm.
before you could have zero.
Yes.
So, one implies, that there was a beingness. There's to be is active at that stage. And it's interesting when you go one and zero, that is what, you
And
know,
zero being nil.
nil, which is binary computer code,
Yeah.
off on switch. The other thing that kind of relates to this, I wrote a note. I think this fits in with this. Again, this is science fiction, although there is some.
Oh, and it should be mentioned. It's also the basis of mathematical language, the
Oh yeah,
binary coding.
absolutely.
Yeah, one
Yeah,
and zero is the
a-
basis of all mathematical
oh,
language.
exactly. But from a just Star Trek science or Star Trek science fiction, a note that I wrote that may apply here is when somebody's beamed, they go in the transporter,
Mm-hmm.
and you know their molecules, atoms, whatever, are disassembled and transmitted as an energy field, as energy of some sort, and then it's reassembled on the receiving end. So, what does that say about that person, that individual, when they're in transit? Are they existing as an energy field then? Again, this is science fiction, but the interesting thing about this, there's been some research apparently on trying to transport objects
Mm-hmm.
physically in this way. I don't know if it's ever possible. I don't know if we'll figure it out, but just like you're talking about, there's mathematics to support warp theory. There apparently is some physics to the sort about the idea of beaming in the way that's
Well,
conceived in Star Trek.
well, getting as I discussed in the previous episode, most of what we are made up of is space. So we know that on a subatomic level, our atoms are held together relatively by relatively fragile electrons. So the idea of breaking down those electrons and then somehow reassembling those electrons again and rebinding them into their original configuration, which I guess is what a transporter would do,
Mhm.
is what we're talking about here. But just I can see that being theoretically possible, but it seems like, as with everything, getting back to, and again, Melody Sheep's been great for me and Ben, but the problem with the theory of relativity, E equals mc square, is that that's taking a very small amount of mass and moving it at the speed of light. Um, are we breaking down our physical patterns into light? What kind of energy are we breaking our physical patterns down into? Microwaves, radiation? Um, I I often wonder because the way, and sticking to the science fiction aspect of this, the way they always depict, and I think you would remember this as well. There's always been a different depiction of what transporting looks like in terms of the destabilization of the actual physical pattern, where it seemed like in previous series, it kind of tore apart because the beams would separate kind of horizontally, and then later on it would kind of like tear them apart vertically, and then like bring them back together. the same way.
Well, that's an interesting observation because even within Next Generation, you'll see different species, different races have their own transporter system.
Mm-hmm.
But to differentiate between the species, the pattern, it looks totally different. And then thinking about it, said, well, if it's all the same thing, why should it look different? And that might be just again part of the story to differentiate that. Well, Romulan beaming works. Well, maybe it's saying, well, Romulans can beam, but their beaming is a little bit different from Federation beaming.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think
So it,
one
yeah, go ahead.
question there is to ask is like, does it come down to like DNA? Like how do you transfer the DNA pattern from one place to the other?
Well, that just gets in that if you're deconstructing, you know, the physical, the matter, which is pretty much an energy field anyway. How far down into nanostructure do you deconstruct things to put it back?
And you know what? Since we're talking about Lonely Among Us in this episode, because Picard at the very end kind of rescues himself by
Mm-hmm.
stealing back aboard the Enterprise and working his way through the computer system to alert
Mm-hmm.
them using the helm panel to show a P for his name,
Mm-hmm.
and then they figure out how to recorporealize him using the transporter. One question we have to ask is like, okay, Picard is under the influence of the Better Runner entity, transports his pattern out into the cloud. Yet somehow he has the wherewithal and the will and the consciousness, still in the sentience, to steal back aboard the Enterprise, signal the crew, and somehow be in the appropriate transporter pad to be recorporealized. Throughout the show, there's always been the problem of them losing someone's pattern, or someone's pattern getting lost in transit. And it used to be like, if I think it was it motion picture where they had like a transporter malfunction and someone died horrifically.
Yeah, somebody was reassembled and they were just like a like a sort of a monster birth. It
Yeah,
was just like a genetic accident, and luckily, it did not. The person did not live for long.
yeah,
And then you had the other thing in Enterprise,
right.
where
Oh yeah, they beamed him in, and he beamed up with all those particulates, and they were stuck inside of
well
him.
that happened, and there was also remember in Enterprise, I forget the man's name.
But he lived. Phlox saved him.
Yes, Flock saved him, but there was one scientist who was a colleague of Ephraim Cochrane who had developed beaming or something. Yeah,
Oh, I know who you're talking about.
and
Yeah,
his son had got caught in the pattern like for 15 years,
yeah,
and he basically lied about this experiment and got on board the Enterprise because he wanted
yes,
to use it to try to bring his son back.
yeah.
And they found out that he couldn't. But that was interesting because
Archer and the guy's daughter had a previous relationship.
yes, and that the man's son had existed in this buffered pattern for like 15 years or something like that.
Hmm. Oh, and they did that later on. When uh Montgomery Scott shows up in
Oh,
Next
that's right.
Generation.
That's right. Yeah.
Yeah,
That's
during the
right.
Dyson Sphere episode.
Yeah.
So like, the problem that I'm seeing now is just an inconsistency of the show. Like, if someone loses their pattern, is their pattern lost because it seems like they lose Picard's pattern, but Picard's pattern still has consciousness enough to save itself? Does that mean suddenly all these people that died in these episodes had the ability to save themselves, but the technology just wasn't there yet? Like, it's an inconsistency of the show that I'm just noticing now that is kind of bugging me a little bit. But it gets into the question like, if you destabilize us, do we still retain our consciousness? Like, here's a horrifying question, Dad. Let's say your pattern is lost in midst of being transported down to a planet. Do you realize you die?
Well, what maybe just think of this because it gets into sort of a more, I guess you could say it's practical, is, what happens when you have these near death experiences where
Mm-hmm.
somebody's in the operating table and they may possibly suffer some severe anoxia, transient brain death, and they find themselves, they have this experience where, they see the big light, but
Mm-hmm.
particularly what they see is they see themselves outside of their body above the operating table. And then that doesn't last. And they come back into their body and they can recount everything that was said and everything that was done to them while they were in this altered state. And I don't know if they figured this out, or where the research is that just in the person's subconscious actually recording this and projecting in that way, or are we actually having, you know, a extracorporeal, truly spiritual experience of some sort? Which gets into, one of the questions that comes up is about states of being, goes back to, what you just said. If somebody is beamed in science fiction and their patterns lost, uh, you know, do you realize that you're dead, or is there something to is there actually a human soul? How does that exist? In what state does it exist? So that if you're physically dematerialized, you know, do you still have some sense of self? Does some sense of self persist? Which really gets into another ultimate question: is after you die, is there some sense of self that persists?
Well, let's deal with this question one part at a time. I think the first question that we're generally asking is like, do we believe in ghosts? Um, because ultimately, like that's the question here. If you dematerialize your physical form or you die, your physical form is removed from you, but suddenly your, I guess, your energy pattern or your soul still exists, and you are still bound somehow to this plane. It, by definition, Picard is a ghost when he's dead when he's beamed off the ship by the entity. Even Troy says something that I kind of, it wasn't until the second watch through that I heard it, and it kind of disturbed me. And the third one, I watched the episode for a third time tonight before we recorded. She says this Picard doesn't remember the events exactly, and it's the use of the word this Picard, because there's kind of like this, I don't know, it felt like there was this coded kind of assumption like this is Jean-Luc Picard and he's alive, but the Picard that we beamed out there is definitely dead. Like we definitely beamed out Jean-Luc Picard's physical form. Like that guy's physical form died, but now he's back. Um I think there's a lot of, I don't know, maybe I'm looking into the syntax too deeply, but I think the question of if we exist in an energy pattern, what does that mean ultimately? I don't know. Am I kind of skirting around your question? Like it.
No, I mean just thinking about other parts of Star Trek. I mean, if we talk to a Vulcan, they would say, well, the answer's simple. Everyone has a contra.
Oh yeah, Katra. Well, do you know what? It's actually interesting in Enterprise, because they don't at the time of Enterprise, the Vulcans don't believe in Katras.
No, because they rediscovered
Surek's teachings.
Surek's teaching during Enterprise, correct?
But it's very interesting. It means that the Vulcans at one point were very much atheists. Like they didn't believe in the transference of the spirit or the continuation, really, of the spirit, because like they didn't believe in Katras.
Right.
So, scientifically speaking, we're working in a universe where they actually do believe in the idea of the spirit body or the light body, as we sometimes deem it in occult or metaphysical terms. Um, but it's a scientific thing in Star Trek that is kind of recognized as being real. But I think um, the second part of the question, we the first one is like, do we believe in ghosts?
Mm-hmm.
I, the second part of the question is, what is it? I want to phrase this because I don't want it to sound dumb, but it could sound dumb. What does it mean to actually be alive?
Well, that's a good essential question because it goes back to you couldn't have a zero until you had the concept of one.
Mm-hmm.
So how do you know you're dead if you don't know you're alive?
And but well, kind of making that illusion, you know, the the distinguishment between one and zero is the fact that the brain can make the distinguishment between one and zero. That's really kind of the miracle.
And that goes back to what we discussed last episode is cogito ergo sum.
Yeah. I think I've always considered the but this gets into a discussion we've often had about the Bhagavad Gita. You know, these bodies definitely are transitory and they're momentary and they're not part of the ineffable or the ephemeral that I think real reality is probably made up of. Um and, you having been in ophthalmology and ophthalmology sorry having been in ophthalmology for such a long time in tissue donation, you know that the human eye only sees so much of the actual visual spectrum that is available to be seen. Other animals pick up other spectrums, including the infrared spectrum, electromagnetic
Mm-hmm.
some even pick up the electromagnetic spectrum. So there's so many things around us, even now, in our current material everyday reality or waking world that we do not see happening around us. Um, I think the longer I go on, the less and less I'm actually worried about death. I think Star Trek kind of has played a huge role in this. Um, you know, Starting with the idea that death is already kind of a temporary thing, or just a kind of a liminal experience. Um, I think Star Trek has always put to ease the idea that there's much more to be perceived than we expect. And to simply assume that there is an end to these things, or, we simply snap out of existence, is is a definite possibility. But there's also this grander, more wonderful possibility that the exploration of the journey continues, that we continue to boldly go forth. Um, I think Star Trek has been very helpful in helping develop kind of that feeling and maybe a sense of, peace with the idea of there being a physical end to this journey that I'm on. I have to say the hardest thing to tackle is expecting the end of other people on this journey, you know? I think that's really the hardest thing to deal with
Mhm.
because it's easy for you to say for yourself, "Oh, I know I'm going to go one day and I can accept that." But I think it's very hard to see the people around you go
Mhm.
and then measuring your own mortality against that.
Mhm.
Because I think it speaks less to like, I think that we are less, and this gets back to um, the beta
Brown
Renner
cloud.
cloud. Um, I think our true fear of death is being alone. I think we are so afraid of facing that liminal moment alone because it,
Mhm.
and we'll talk about this in other episodes, but I've had a lot of spiritual experiences, but I've also had a lot of spiritual experience involving psychedelics. And there's very much a liminal aspect to the use of psychedelics.
What was the adjective you used?
Liminal,
Liminal.
between places, between things.
Okay.
Um, I think death and life are very interchangeable, and I think there is a fear of loneliness in that we are going to be alone when we have to make these changes. And one thing that I noticed that the Beta Renner cloud entity said was when he finally got around to Picard, he said, I found someone who shared something with me that I could take that that could go with me on this journey as I leave. You know,
Yes, interesting because it.
we shared this passion for exploration, so like he's coming with me.
Well, yeah, it goes back to the title of the episode, "Lonely Among Us."
Oh, well, like
What you said is that what was the entity in the cloud? Was it a singular entity? Was it a multiple entity? And it seems like as the story progressed that there were multiple entities because but one of them, accidentally was captured by the Enterprise, studies humans,
mhm.
um, finds Picard, chooses him as uh, a fellow explorer. Well, why did the entity do that? Well, because it was because, as you say, there was a sense of loneliness. He was by himself, um, which addresses the issue bring up about feelings of loneliness when thinking about death.
I think death has become in our modern society such a singular thing, both in our depiction of it in terms of our entertainment and our art, and even in terms of our news media. The way we depict death is a very singular thing. Sometimes we do it very much by the numbers. It's not that people died today from the coronavirus. It's that 4,000 individual people died. um we're talking about some heavy stuff here, especially for a child sleeping not far from me. Um,
You have to put a label on their Ben. You can only open this until you're 18 or until you're 21, something like that.
well, like let's talk about that. There was this moment where the Beta Renner entity inhabits Beverly Crusher, and she goes back to Beverly Crusher's quarters that she shares with Wesley. And she takes not only an interest in like what Wesley's studying in terms of warp theory as it pertains to forcing dilithium crystals into new forms to take different intermixes, but like she's actually interested in like the fact that like here's this woman I've inhabited and she's living with her child. So she actually takes interest in like the interaction with her child. And I think to a certain extent, for all the misanthropes out there who say they really want to be alone, I think the most human thing that we want is to know we're not alone. And I think death is one of those things that you must face alone. Um,
Yes.
in terms of like the interstitial part of you going.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I'm saying a lot. Sorry, folks. But this is heavy, heavy stuff for me. Shit. Ah. I think Lonely Among Us talks about the fact that we don't want to go by ourselves. I think the
Mm-hmm.
something that the beta runner wants before it leaves is to know that, like, if it goes back to what it's going back to, it's not going to be alone in it. And I think that's a stand in for us wanting to know that if we kind of go, we're not going to be alone ourselves. And even like, there's a reaction to the death that the crew has because they at one point perceive that Picard's dead.
Mm-hmm.
And I've there's always little things I want to talk about in terms of the show. And I always find like I think this show in the first season always kind of sets up the possibility that Picard's going to die and that Riker's going to take over. And I think they actually set that up all the way up through the Borg in the end of season 2 into season 3, beginning of season 3. That there's always this possibility that Picard could die and Riker would become captain. Because they always kind of set Riker up to be, a main character as well. And the captain, traditionally, the captain was always Kirk. It was always kind of a singular focus.
Mm-hmm.
But Riker gets a lot of equal attention next to Picard as well. And I
Mm-hmm.
think I've always thought like there was this kind of aura of death over the first 2 seasons when it became to Picard. Like, this guy could potentially go. Picard goes in this episode. And there's this scene on the bridge where they're all looking around. And even Geordi says, like, we're just going to leave him. And I
Mm-hmm.
think that reflects what I'm talking about. The idea that, like, okay, Picard's dead. Like, let's go with what everyone in the crew is assuming at its worst. Picard's dead. We're gonna leave
Right,
him.
because Riker says we have to continue with our mission.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Um. I think that's everyone's deep-seated fear that they're going to be left behind. They're going to be left behind alone. That they're going to die alone. And I think that we're all scared that someone's going to leave us behind, or not take us with us, even if we are dead. Because we have funeral customs and death rituals that even here in America, like in the military, we don't leave our dead behind, or we don't leave anyone behind even if they're
Well,
dead.
well,
Like,
part of this is also is do we not want to die alone? But because there's so much discussion, belief, which is pure based on faith, there's no empirical evidence that when we physically die, there's an afterlife that we go to, that we continue. Is part of this the fear that when we die, we just die and there's nothing afterward, which would
yeah.
make one feel very, very lonely then.
Oh yeah, I think there's a huge part of that playing into
Because
this.
we've talked about this, and it's pretty well understood by some people is a lot of religion is just helping humankind how to deal with death, how to deal
Oh
with
yeah.
mortality, how to deal with existence.
Well, even the beta rare cloud, and it's you know one thing that I think that we should kind of take a side detour and talk about that scene where Picard finally reveals like he's possessed by the beta rare cloud entity, and the entity kind of explains why they did what they did. First of all, um, this is a great episode in terms of Patrick Stewart's acting. Just
Mm-hmm.
a tremendously great episode. In this scene here, there is a, and I think he gets into the nature of like what would happen if humans ran into an entity that didn't have to worry about, was free of the considerations of the corporeal, not like, free in terms of consideration of like life and death, but free of like the morality of having to think about, oh, if I stab this person, that hurts them. Because this entity doesn't ever really stop and think, oh, if I do this to this person, this is hurting them. Even though it does say like it's sorry that it killed Engineer Singh, it still killed Engineer Singh. It's, and it's ready to quickly kind of move on. It has a very different set of morality and ethics when it comes to the physical realm that it's dealing with, because it doesn't have a physical realm, and it doesn't have a physical realm until it like runs into um, the Enterprise, and it runs into these beings, and it has no reference until it runs into the computer and can figure it all out.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I think there is a certain level of, I think it's easy to paint it as malicious, to paint the entity itself as malicious in that scene with that
I,
speech, but I
I,
don't think it necessarily is.
I did not construe or perceive the entity or entities as malicious in this case.
I think it's somewhat built into it because there's, and again, I think this is one of the better parts of the episode. There's real tension when Riker and Dr. Crusher have to have the discussion of whether or not they're going to remove the captain from command. It's
Mm-hmm.
actually one of the better parts of the entire episode
Mm-hmm.
where, there's this real question once they know that kind of Picard's not acting correctly, that do we remove the captain? Like there's real consequences if we remove him and we do it improperly or don't have a good reason. And even up to the point where like Picard's revealing that he's not dominated, but kind of possessed by another entity, they still have, refused to remove him from command. There's a very good tension, I think, in this episode when it comes to dealing with that plot device.
Mm-hmm.
I think I think some people see the entity as being nefarious or malicious just because of kind of the way Picard acts in those scenes when they're trying to determine whether or not he is trustworthy enough to still be in command. And
Well, but
I think this has a lot to do with Patrick Stewart's acting, because he's very he's able to make himself he's able to turn off the things that make him seem like Picard enough that you can tell something's wrong. Sorry, go on. You
I'm
were
just going to
gonna
say
say.
the other thing, just human nature. When you come on a situation that's unknown or not understood, the tendency is to first assess whether it is a threat or not.
Mm-hmm.
And that goes back maybe to just our old reptilian brain to say,
Well,
hey,
the
what
reptilian
am I
thing.
dealing with here?
It's is it even reptilian brain, or is it the binary thinking? Is it a threat or not? Yes or
Yes.
no?
Yeah. Right.
Um,
Right.
I think the real tension that Crusher and Riker deal with is that they don't have an easy binary.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that is really, kind of circling around. The real kind of crux that I found interesting coming away from this episode. What would happen if we ran into an entity or an organism or a sentient being that was energy that could easily possess our technological systems? Because, one thing that we haven't talked about in this episode is the being often starts shutting down aspects of the Enterprise. It doesn't do anything that's, outright dangerous. It shuts down their warp drive a couple times.
Mm-hmm.
It shuts, it makes certain things malfunction, but it's never like planning to blow up the ship. It even says that. So, like, they found ways just to stop this Enterprise thing. But, what happens if humans were to run into that? How helpless would we be? I think this episode does a really good job of kind of painting out that helplessness, because the resolution, as a writer, you always look kind of like at the structure of an episode in terms of how the story is being told, from the inciting incident, which is the Enterprise going through that cloud, to the resolution, which is getting Picard back on the transporter pad. Because the story between the Antikins and the Soleil is not even the story being told. That's just there for comedic effect.
Right. Absolutely. Yes.
Um, the the I think the difficult thing is that if we run into a species of sentient being or consciousness, how would we really deal with it? And I think what the crew of the Enterprise deals with is probably very realistic to what we might deal with if we did. I don't think that we would be able to handle it. I don't think that we would have a method of controlling or defending ourselves from it. The episode really is kind of a hostage situation where the Beta Renner entity comes aboard and basically has his way, or has their way, all the way back to the cloud when it rejoins its populace. I think there's some real interesting things to think about here in terms of space exploration if we were to run into, life and civilization that we've never seen before.
What goes back to my observation or comment about the discussion of states of being. What are the possible states of being? I thought
Yes.
of, what's really goes on with the Bermuda Triangle, with the disappearance of ships and planes, and there might be something physical that we don't understand related to weather phenomenon, or actually physical phenomena that we don't understand. Um, Bubbling up of giant gas pockets from the ocean so that buoyancy just disappears and ships just are swallowed up. But what I really think about in terms of states of being, you know, uh, going back to legends, which, a legend is somewhat of a fairy tale, but it always has a degree of truth in it, as I understand. And that's the Philadelphia experiment.
Mm-hmm.
What happened in World War II in the Philadelphia Navy Yard, where supposedly they
No,
put this
please tell the
giant.
audience a little bit about it,
Well, what
please.
happened, as I understand it, I think it was 1943, there was a destroyer at the Philadelphia Navy Yard, and what they did is put a giant, Gaussian generator. They wanted it was basically, they wanted to make the ship invisible to radar. It was like a cloaking device, but for radar.
Oh, right. Okay. Yeah.
And they created such a large and strong magnetic field that supposedly what happened is that the ship dematerialized. It actually disappeared.
Right. Yeah.
For some, I remember how long. I don't remember where it went, but when it rematerialized, there were some sailors that were actually, like that one episode in Star Trek where they materialized half in the deck and they
Yeah.
didn't survive. And the story goes that there were some of the crewmen that were seriously psychologically affected and went mad. And it's one of these things. It's one of these stories like Area 51.
Oh, yeah.
You know, it's or the Roswell incident.
Or
It's
Tesla building a death ray. Did Tesla actually build a death ray?
yeah. I mean, there's stories like that, which you know there's no basis for it. There's not enough evidence, but there's enough circumstantial evidence, whatever that comes out, that there's some reality to this, to the basis of the story, but we don't know the whole story.
Well, getting into what you said about legends having a certain degree of truth, I think what happens, and this kind of gets back into the earlier conversation we had before the episode about American Christianity. Haha, people at home, I told you I'd tie it back together. Um, I think we build collective myths as a society. and that we build
Hmm.
them around these kind of unifying ideas and things. And while the
Hmm.
unifying thing ideas and things themselves may not be true, and I think when we discover that they're not true, the effects are far reaching and devastating.
They are absolutely.
Um, for example, and we can talk about this one as an example a little bit. Um, I grew up idolizing George Washington for a longest time, one of my favorite presidents. But if I'm going to be honest about George Washington, I have to be honest about certain things about his content and his character. For example, he was a slave owner. He, despite the reports of him trying to free his slaves at the end of his life, he in fact did not. He just gave them over to Martha, who did not free them, or did not, who only freed one that was his personal slave. But like, I have to measure the fact that one of the founding fathers, who I think is a good moral person, was taking part in one of the most immoral and spiritually, physically, just in every philosophical way, reprehensible moments and practices in human history. You know, we we have this collective myth here in America about George Washington being kind of the scion and paragon of everything good about our American democracy. But if you have to hold it up to the fact that he's a slave owner, and that slave owner includes all of these horrific human crimes, all of a sudden this belief kind of falls apart and shambles. It's like, the only thing that people don't know is the only thing people don't know about their heroes is the worst thing about their heroes.
Yes, it's just that no human is perfect, and I think this is an interesting thing because history doesn't become history until it's history.
Well, like,
And
we're do
let me finish. I think that one of the things that I've come to understand
yeah, sorry,
in the
absolutely.
Declaration of Independence, they wanted to consider, or it may have been in the Constitutional Convention, they wanted to, in those early days of the Republic, consider actually outlawing slavery. And it was a north south thing then because there was not slavery per se in the northern states. It was prevalent and a necessary evil in the southern states because they were agriculturally based.
Well,
And
the
there,
argument was made it's a necessary evil.
it was a necessary evil. And because of the politics to try to bring the country together, particularly, I think, under the Constitution, they couldn't abolish slavery then. And it took, until what, the 13th Amendment in 1863 for that to happen. But that process still isn't complete today, in a
Well,
sense.
it gets, and I promise I'll tie this back into American Christianity, folks, because I promised. Um, it gets back into those kind of legends that we build. We built kind of this. Okay, let's take a very difficult one to talk about because we just got a day off because of him. Martin Luther King. Martin Luther King is a wonderfully celebrated figure in American history for all of the right reasons. He led a incredibly impassioned, important march for civil rights that was a success and a model for peaceful protest around the globe, even today. The contributions of Martin Luther King cannot be disregarded in any way, shape, or form. The problem that we don't ever acknowledge is that during the time he was doing that, he was incredibly unpopular in America. He was scorned during that entire period by most of the media and press. He was not very popular. He was hunted by the American government under the direction of Herbert J. Edgar
J. Edgar
Hoover
Hoover.
and the FBI. He was smeared violently, publicly, and ultimately assassinated. We don't tell this story because if you really tell this story about King in an honest way, the idea that somehow he was ultimately successful in terms of bringing civil rights, or that the work of civil rights was successful, is suddenly not the this certified legend anymore, because what it reveals is that civil rights is an ongoing process that never ends, that the work
Mm-hmm.
itself never ends. But
Mm-hmm.
America has bought into all of these myths of things came to the end of history myths
Mm-hmm.
that started with the end of the Cold War,
Mm-hmm.
that capitalism won. So there's no better system that we can ever consider ever
Right.
again other than
Right.
capitalism. You
Right.
know, um, all of these things kind of are built on this somewhat Judeo-Christian narrative of like, again, there's this binary. It's either going to be good versus evil, and if good wins, you know, no bad is going to ever happen again. But the truth is, good and evil are always working in this kind of nexus against each other. And they're never, and this is kind of a Star Wars conversation, but like they're never in balance with each other. The only thing that really balances good and evil are the people that are working on both sides. It's the work of the people on the side of good to stop the people on the side of evil, and it's the work on people, the work on of people on the side of evil to get what they want. I think we here in America have developed this kind of um it's definitely juvenile, it's definitely immature, but I think
Well,
it's
you're
worse than that. I think it's infantilized. We've kind of developed this infantilized view of our legends.
yeah, I think that you're setting things up. That's something we've already discussed. That and then when we do the next episode, that'll come up is the term moral relativism.
Yes. Well, like, I think one of the reasons we're having such a huge issue now in American Christianity is because Christ wasn't morally relative about certain things. And it's now been made clear that the leaders of mainstream Protestant churches have done things and are doing things as we speak that are just not in line with the teachings of Christ. Like, there is no moral relativism on you taking your parishioners' money and paying for your mega mansion in Charlotte. There's
Right.
no moral relativism about you saying that you're the vicar of Christ, and when you sit on a throne, you speak for God and then cover up decades of child molestation and abuse. Like,
Mm-hmm.
I think ultimately what's happening in American Christianity, and Trump was the catalyst for it, is that they're finally having to have a reckoning with all the morally relative decisions they've made versus the actual the actual difficulty of having to live by Christ's teachings, which are not morally relativistic.
Mm-hmm.
And even when someone, I'm sorry, someone I'm really into, who was an ethnobiologist and psychedelic philosopher, Terence McKenna. One of
Mm-hmm.
the things that we in the psychedelic movement believe, and I say we, I consider myself a part, but I don't speak for everyone. But one thing that we see as a huge problem within society is moral relativism, because there's just some things that you can't be morally relativist. I'm sorry, morally relativistic about, like the environment. If you destroy the air, poison the water, remove our ability to grow food, it doesn't matter what you think about feminism or communism or egalitarianism or Christianity or what the Red Sox are going to do next season. It doesn't matter. Like, it
Right.
just doesn't matter.
Right.
Like, the right moral ethical thing is to save the planet so we can stay alive. You know, we know for a fact that invading other countries to strip them for their mineral resources is only leading to more death and destruction, in that the ultimate return on those mineral resources isn't worth the effort in terms of the lives lost and bloodshed created for those actual minerals that we took. Like, we're coming up, we're scraping up against the crack of an age where we are really, and I use the word the phrase crack of an age from the Bhagavad Gita, because we're coming up on the really difficult struggle between what is really right and what is really wrong. And I think people know intrinsically, unless you're a psychopath or a sociopath, and while those people are out there, the psychopaths and sociopaths are out there, they really are a small percentage of the general human population. Most of us can tell the difference between right and wrong. And I was talking about left and right earlier and having to be established to that binary, and we've talked about binaries a lot tonight.
Mm-hmm.
There's one binary that we keep kind of dodging here in America, and that's the binary of really what is right and what is really wrong. And for example, let's take an issue where I think we confuse right versus wrong versus an issue where it should be a real conversation of right versus wrong. And everyone at home, I'm sorry, I'm tackling a controversial issue, but this is how I feel. The issue of our trans brothers and sisters here in America. It shouldn't be an issue. It shouldn't
No.
be an issue. What someone decides to do with their own gender identity and their own lifestyle in their own house within their own family, and if their family's willing to love and accept them as they are, it's none of our business. It shouldn't be an issue. If they are a free and American, they should be allowed to do what they want. This is not an issue. Versus, should healthcare be a human right? Should people be forced to die in a hospital because they can't afford care that can keep them alive or not? Or keep their child alive or not? Versus, should someone be able to make money off of their suffering? Like, we confuse the issue of should trans people be allowed to be people as a right or wrong issue when we already know, like, leave them alone. They should have the right to be who they are, versus a real right or wrong issue of should should our healthcare system be about making money, or should it be about saving people's lives and taking care of
Your point
patients?
is your point is if you compare the two situations, that there's energy being spent on the first where it doesn't need to be spent, and we've been talking about the second, healthcare being a right, and whether people should companies should monetarily profit off of it. It's a discussion that's been going on for years, and um, we there's as a society, there's a number of people who don't believe it's a right.
Yeah.
They don't believe it's right. There are people I remember talking to some family members who thought that during the Obama years with Obamacare, the death panels were actually set up. And it's like, yeah, death panels exist. It's actually whether or not somebody has access to health care, whether they can afford insurance. That's where the death panel comes in, as I see it.
Well, the
Well, what's really not death paneling is like what it is that
end of
well,
life end of
no,
life
it's
protocols.
rationing of care. There
Yeah.
is rationing of care based on economics.
Well, I'd really want to talk to those conservatives now with the coronavirus about rationing of care. Um, because our hospitals are strapped in terms of rationing care.
Right.
But I think it gets into getting back to what the crux of my main argument with this is, we're confusing individual issues of individual liberty with issues of actual life and death.
Well, it goes back to that, just as there should not be any discussion as to whether people have a right to health care. Moving up to the bigger point is that there should not be any ambivalence that we have to be better stewards of spaceship Earth.
Yeah, exactly. Well, like, okay, um, we talk all the time about here's a real moral issue that we don't really talk about. Like, should America be at war? Should America be in the business of killing people? That that's a real question that we haven't really asked ourselves since the Patriot Act. Because let me tell you, this country kills a lot of people every year. A lot of people. Sometimes accidentally through collateral damage. But we kill a lot of people. I think that there's a real moral question in this country. Like, is our purpose here to continue global conflicts through our individual dealings with client states? Like, Joe Biden, and I guess we're kind of at the end of the episode, people, because we're stepping away from Star Trek now and back into the real world. So thank you for joining us for where no Bubs has gone before. The next episode will be season 1, episode 8, Justice. We're really looking forward to it. Thank you for joining us. Love you, Ben. But Joe Biden recently pulled U.S. support for the Saudis out of Yemen.
Right.
That's kind of a huge move because in many ways we are now taking a very difficult moral stance in terms of America's role in the world. Because for a long time, even through the Obama administration, going all the way back even to Clinton, we've had a strong military presence throughout the globe. Going back through the Cold War. We have to ask ourselves now as a question, are we in the business of ending human life? Are we really in the business of protecting it? Because if we're in the business of ending human life, then we have to keep certain client states like certain Syrian forces that we arm. They're in the Syrian conflict. We have to keep allies with the Saudi Arabians, which for what everyone says about them liberalizing their culture, and please, I hope people will understand when I say this. I am not saying this as a critique of Islam or Muslims or even Saudi Arabians themselves. I'm saying this about the royal house of Saud, which is probably going to get us kicked off YouTube when they finally hear this. And I mean YouTube. The royal house of Saud probably gives less a shit about us. 2 American white boys talking shit about them. Who cares? But we're in bed with people that murder a lot more people every day. I think that we have a real hard moral question going forward in terms of leading this country out of where we've ended up of, are we going to keep being in this business?
Well, here's my last comment. If we're trying to wrap things up, is for years now, the Defense Department in its annual, strategic overview, they see climate change
Mm-hmm.
as a concern, as a strategic threat to the country.
The Navy's taken it super seriously.
How does the military respond to that? Do they see that, well, this is going to be a source of conflict, so we need to prepare for conflict? Or do you take the other side as like, this is a global problem that has to be addressed, so that the way to address it is not ultimately through conflict, but through working through other government agencies to ameliorate the problem, so that you de-escalate, if possible, the geopolitical conflicts that are going to come from climate change.
I think that's where we're going to again get into the very difficult question of what is right and wrong versus what is morally relative. Because
Yes.
we've discussed Russia on previous episodes here. Vladimir
Right.
Putin, and even Xi Jinping in China, they want climate change to occur because the geological benefits to Russia and China of the climate warming and them having more arable land, especially for Russia and Siberia, where they would be able to not only access huge timber reserves and natural mineral resources, but they are probably sending on one of the largest potential petrol excavation sites on the planet that isn't under the Arctic Sea. We're going to have to face this conflict between first world countries and also emerging countries that haven't had the time to catch up technologically to us to where they can have a green innovation. if I'm
Well,
Vladimir Putin and the entire world comes to me and says, "Hey, you have to stop using petroleum because it's affecting the climate," and I'm Vladimir Putin, I say, "But if I keep affecting the climate, it's actually good for me and my people."
I read an article today that Shell Oil has made it their strategic view is the largest, the sale of petroleum products globally peaked in 2019,
Mm-hmm.
and that will only decrease from here because of the movement toward renewables, green energy, etc.
Well, like, putting on my environmentalist hat, which is my favorite hat to wear, these petroleum producers should be watching their asses because, in many ways, they are responsible for some of the greatest climate catastrophes in history. Petroleum, we always think about cars and kind of what the carbon we're putting up in the air, but we're not thinking about the plastic that we're using, that we're generating with petroleum, and how much of it is ending up in landfills and our natural water supplies, but also in the ocean, and how it's
Right.
devastating aquatic
Well,
life.
that's starting to be realized, but the solution is a long way off. But the other thing about the energy companies, which are mainly petroleum based, they have to reinvent themselves. Like, you know, the um, the railroads, they used to be passenger and freight. They're not passenger anymore, except in some countries where they've gone to high speed rail because they didn't see aircraft uh, 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 coming. So I think that if there's truly a movement toward alternative energy, then those energy companies have to go with that flow ultimately.
Can, can I be? Oh, well, my honest response to that is the same thing when we talk about healthcare and how we really
It's the
reformat
same
healthcare.
thing. It's
But
the same thing.
but as we also often discuss, Dad, um, is there a future really with private insurance? Like, in the long term future, is insurance something that actually exists? Long term, do these petroleum companies really have a place at the table? Because what are they going to turn into if they're not petroleum companies? Are they going to
Unless they
suddenly
can
turn?
reinvent him, and they have to reinvent themselves.
Well, it'd be one thing for BP to say, like, we're slowly going to phase out petroleum, but it'd be a bigger thing for BP to come out and say, we're not only going to phase out petroleum, but our new avenue is wind or solar. Like, our goal is that we want solar panels in every American household
They
by
they
2030.
they have to do that in the same way that General Motors has made the claim that by 2035 they will not make any internal combustion powered cars.
But see, like, I think when we, getting back to what I was saying in terms of America coming up against a bunch of things, in terms of this crack of the age we're facing, like, that's the kind of moral decision making you have to make. Like, it's great that General Motors has actually made the decision, even though they might not be making it out of purely altruistic
Right,
reasons. But,
right.
like, we need to have stable electric engines to replace petroleum engines because the carbon output is really devastating the planet.
You need to have the power grid to support it.
And but it's good, but we have to make more decisions like that.
Right.
American Christianity has to make the decision: are they followers of Christ, or are they followers of a specific person that fits their political ideology when it
Hmm.
suits them? And that
Hmm.
not only goes to, like, conservatives on the Trump side, that also goes to liberals on the Biden side.
Hmm.
Because, one thing that's come up against Biden, which is a real issue that he has to deal with, and it's going to be something that plagues him throughout his presidency, whether it's 4 years or 8 years. He's a Catholic. He's a very devoted Catholic who somehow believes that he can be pro-life and there not be a problem with that. It may not be a problem with him, but for a lot of conservative Catholics,
Right.
it
I've
really
thought about
is.
that. Yes.
You
Right.
know, just kind of summing up what we were talking about earlier, before and after the episode, it's America has tried to dodge these conversations for a long time through our collective legends. Um, we've tried to avoid having these conversations by telling ourselves these kind of affirming stories of how wonderful we are. But the truth is, the affirmations have rung hollow, the stories have been told too many times that they're no longer new or novel. And getting back to Terrence McKenna, I think not only do humans want companionship, because death is a lonely thing, I think they want novelty too. We also want new things every so often. We want new stories, and we want new lessons, and we want new ways of perceiving things. I think one problem we're running into is that people are now perceiving that these old legends aren't working. And what happens when the old legends don't work anymore and your measure of perception isn't there like it used to be? Or the thing that established your measure of perception is no longer applicable. Like we had, you and I had the discussion last episode about how I think science needs to take a more observant and a more investigative view of like the occult or the supernatural and the paranormal.
Mm-hmm.
One episode they're going to have in Next Generation in the second season, um, they even asked Picard, and it's the one where they're dealing with Nagilum. I don't know if you remember that one. He's the the hole in space that they get trapped in.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
But like
Vaguely.
one thing that Data asks is like, what do you think death is? And it's really Nagilum testing Picard. And I think one thing Picard says, like I just watched Lonely Among Us, but one thing Picard says is that at some point, people think that either he makes the illusion that people think death is either heaven or it's nothingness. And I think the truth lies in the fact that we don't know what it is. And
Mm-hmm.
here in America, especially in terms of our spirituality, we don't know what the outcome is of having these actual conversations. And we don't know the actual outcome of having to make these real moral and ethical decisions of where a major religion is going to go, not only in terms of like its mainline instances, but also its evangelical and probably alternative and outlying forms.
Mm-hmm.
Because there has been real stability in Christianity for 1,000 years. It has had a very long, successful run. There is no reason to believe it can't fall down. Anyone who believes something can't fall down doesn't read enough history.
And it's had a lot of rough spots over that 2,000-year run as well.
Well, like, one thing that I always try to point out to every Christian, including the ones that are alive now, whether they're on the right side or the left side, is that if Jesus came back here now, he wouldn't recognize a single thing going on around him.
No, he would not.
The only place that he would recognize anything going on would be at a synagogue.
Mm-hmm.
Like, he'd get that. But
Mm-hmm.
everything else that would be going on, like, he'd walk into a cathedral and he'd be like, what the hell is this? He's like, I didn't tell you guys to build this. This is crazy.
Mm-hmm.
But that's another thing, I keep thinking about Charlotte when we talk about American Christianity, because Charlotte's the hotbed for American Christianity, especially the evangelical movement in many ways, with the Billy Graham Library being there. One of the things that I recognized when I moved to Charlotte and when I moved out of Charlotte is that there was a lot of money being thrown around in religious circles. A lot of money. And I keep thinking about Jesus taking his whip and walking into the temple to empty out the money changers. And I just bring that up because in Charlotte, there's a lot of money in evangelical Christianity. A lot of money.
Mm-hmm.
There was... Well, okay, he's still there. I think his name's Jesse, or Pastor Jesse, or Father Jesse, or whatever the fuck his name is. Sorry, Ben, I'm cussing now. But like, this dude took like $13 million and built himself a mansion for no other reason than he wanted a mansion. And his congregation let him. So, one thing that we're dealing with is not only people having to deal with the moral and ethical decisions they've made in the name of Christ, but they're also going to have to deal with the fact that they've been permissive in letting certain people get away with a lot of things that are very unchristlike. it would have been one thing if Jesse had taken that $13 million and built a house and then like turned it into an orphanage or turned it into a women's shelter or done something like this. But it's one dude living in a 14,000 square foot house in Charlotte, North Carolina. That's nothing that Jesus would do. So, I
Hmm.
think ultimately that's the kind of things that people are going to have to start confronting. But it's happening in our politics too, and it's happening in gender, and it's happening in you know I think one thing that we're not talking about is kind of the disintegration of the nuclear family and maybe the return of the tribal family.
Hmm.
Like I think that's a real thing that we haven't taken into account yet when it
Mm.
comes to the general, some people say decline, I think evolution of human civilization in the modern world.
Oh, maybe we should, end soon, but I think that has a lot to because I just see within, a family, if you
And it gets back to
define,
loneliness. I don't think we want
well,
to be as lonely as we used to be.
if you defined the nuclear family as the overall family of grandparents and sons and daughters and cousins and nieces and nephews and so forth, that's breaking up. And it's happening because of the beliefs that some groups within the families have are so strong, they're not compatible with one another. So they end up being that we may be part of the same family, but I'm choosing to be part of this tribe and you're choosing to be part of that tribe. So we're going to separate on that basis.
Well, it's we've talked so, and I'll end my part here, if you'd like. But w- one thing that I've always had a problem with in terms of leftist politics, and I consider myself a pretty devoted leftist who's very educated on leftist politics and philosophy. There's always been this kind of argument on the left side that we have to do away with the binary. We have to do away with the gender binary. We have to do away with the economic binary of rich and poor, and we have to do away with all these binaries. And I think the problem is, and I think Troy points it out in the episode. Sorry, the episode really isn't over. But we've kind of stuck ourselves to these binaries in a way. And I think one of the things that we're starting to have to reckon is that, like, oh yeah, yeah, um, yeah, I'll end it here. But like one thing that I think that we have to reckon to is that we're never really going to get rid of this binary thinking, because there really is kind of a right and there is a wrong and there is a left and there is a right and there is a, the sky is blue or the sky isn't blue. So
Mm-hmm.
we are kind of stuck in some ways in terms of this material universe with a binary. But I think now we're dealing with it.
Mm-hmm.
And now we really have to make the decision if we're going to have ones or zeros. And on that
Mm-hmm.
note, I'll end it here. Dad, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. It was
See
fun.
you guys next time for Justice. See ya. Bye.
Bye bye.